much less pay their material compensation for inflicting intergenerational trauma. Russia played a key role in adopting in 1960 at the UN of the Declaration on Granting Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, and extended every assistance to the Africans in their struggle of national liberation, creating their statehood and economy, ensuring their defense, preparing their national specialists. We laud the way they broke colonialism, and we pay a great deal of attention to repertory policy of the continent, and we intend to work together with our African friends on this, including through the Russia-Africa Partnership Forum. The issues of eradicating colonialism and neo-colonialism were at the core of the discussions that took place during the second Russia-Africa Ministerial Conference in Cairo in December last. Madam President, the only opportunity for us to avoid repeating the tragedies of the past is if we keep the memory of the historic truth. And that is why efforts to fight the falsification of history is one of the key areas of Russian foreign policy. In this regard, we would like our support to the draft resolution submitted by Ghana on behalf of the African group on the declaration on the transatlantic trade and racialized slave trade as a gravest crime against humanity. We also support the decisions it made in February at the African Union Assembly aimed at declaring slavery, deportation, colonization, and crimes against humanity and genocide against Africa. Colleagues, the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade is an opportunity for us to remember the fate of those who paid with their lives for the well-being and prosperity of colonial states. But our common efforts for historic justice should not boil down to just one date commemoration. They should be conducted permanently. We're convinced that the document for adoption today would be a milestone in this path and will contribute significantly to the strengthening of the international legal regime of fighting the ramifications of colonialism, racism, and racial discrimination. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Equatorial Guinea.
Excelentísima señora.
Your Excellency, Madam Annalena Baerbock, President of the 80th Session of the General Assembly. Secretary General, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My statement will align itself with the statement delivered by His Excellency the President of the Republic of Ghana on behalf of Africa. Your Excellencies, President of Ghana, we would like to welcome you to New York and thank you for your statement on behalf of Equatorial Guinea. We would like to express to you our recognition for being here with us today at the General Assembly as we commemorate this important event, the commemoration of the International Day of Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. President, your presence here shows how important this event is for Africa, and it bears witness to the tireless efforts that Your Excellency has been making to ensure that the international community and this General Assembly can finally acknowledge this issue and adopt a declaration on the matter of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and say that it is the most serious crime against humanity. Indeed, President, according to UNESCO, between 15 and 20 million Africans were kidnapped and transported against their will from Africa towards North, Central and South America for some 400 years. Many died during their voyage. This widespread deportation effort and the subsequent effects has been considered to be one of the most heinous violations of human rights in the history of humanity. In adopting this declaration and through the relevant resolution, it will now be considered to be the most serious crime against humanity. The effects of this horrendous crime can still be seen in Africa, and the legacy of this continues to have repercussions today in the lives of persons of African descent around the world. Madam President, recognizing the past and building a future of dignity and justice, the theme for this commemoration should lead us to take stock and to think about the sad, shameful legacy that was inflicted upon Africans. Those humans who were subjected to these crimes had little choice. Their only desire was not to die. On this day of commemoration, the Republic of Equatorial Guinea pays tribute to the some 5 million black women and men who were lost in the context of slavery. We pay tribute to all of those valiant fighters from many countries, Jamaica, Haiti, Peru, and the entire diaspora who were affected by these heinous crimes. Madam President, I would like to pay tribute to all of those who were able to build a memorial to honor the memory of those who perished in the context of the transatlantic slave trade, to honor all of those who paid with their lives. The President of Equatorial Guinea has also made a significant contribution to these memorial efforts. I conclude this statement, Madam President, by saying that we are all part of one family, one large family, which is the family of humanity. Within this family, there can be no place for discriminatory treatment against anyone. This year, as we mark the 100th year of the abolition of slavery at the League of Nations in 1926, we all need to honor the memory of those who perished, and we need to say that we must work together and say clearly, never again. Never again can we tolerate this kind of discrimination. We are all part of the same family of humanity. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Equatorial Guinea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Madam President, Excellencies, Vietnam aligns itself with the statement delivered by Lebanon on behalf of the Asia-Pacific Group and wishes to make the following remarks in its national capacity. Today, we honor the memory of the millions of victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in human history. This history is marked not only by immense suffering and injustice, but also by enduring consequences that continue to resonate in various forms across societies today. We stand in solidarity with Africans and people of African descent who continue to bear the lasting impacts of this tragic legacy. In Vietnam, earlier chapters of our own history were also marked by profound suffering, loss, and the denial of fundamental rights under brutal colonialism. While each nation's experience is unique, many of us share a common understanding of the importance of preserving historical memory and upholding human dignity. As former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan once reminded us, I quote, "We may have different religions, different languages, different colored skin, but we all belong to one human race." End of quote. This simple yet powerful truth calls upon us to act with empathy, solidarity, and a shared sense of responsibility. To truly honor the past, we must confront it with honesty, humility, learn from it, and translate remembrance into meaningful action. Justice is not only about reckoning with history, it is about the choices we make today. To that end, we must uphold international human rights framework, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We must also invest in education, promote dialogue and cooperation, and address the lasting consequences of slavery and the slave trade, including through resolute efforts to combat racism and discrimination in all its forms. Honoring the past must guide us towards a more just and inclusive future for all, where dignity is protected, equality is realized, and such tragedies are never repeated. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivian Republic of Venezuela.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela welcomes the statements of those who took part in the opening segment of this meeting. We also welcome the participation of His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, at this meeting. We would also like to pay tribute to the memory of all of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, including their descendants. Today we need to recognize the suffering of the millions of people who were forcibly removed from their lands and taken away from their families and subjected to inhumane treatment. We also need to acknowledge, in this context, the resistance, dignity, and the struggle of those in the midst of such barbarism who defended their humanity and handed down an example of strength and resilience. The commemoration of this International Day also reminds us that racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related forms of intolerance are not relics of the past, which have not been fully overcome today. President, for our country, remembering this historic crime is not just an exercise of memory. It is first and foremost a moral and political duty. Nationally, Venezuela has promoted initiatives such as the establishment of a presidential commission for historic truth, justice, and reparation on the issue of colonial domination and its consequences. At the United Nations, within the group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter, we pushed forward the adoption of Resolution 80/116, which established the 14th of December as the International Day against colonialism in all of its forms and manifestations. We take this opportunity to recognize the leadership of the African Union and the Republic of Ghana at the helm of this draft resolution on the declaration of transatlantic slave trade and racialized slavery of Africans as one of the most heinous crimes against humanity, which will shortly be considered by this General Assembly. Our country has supported this draft resolution from the very beginning, and we invite all delegations to support this initiative by voting in favour of it. We conclude by stressing that will only be genuine justice served when there is truth, reparation, dignity for the peoples affected, and a strong determination to eradicate all contemporary forms of colonialism, racism, and exclusion. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
President, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, I quote, recognizing slavery and the transatlantic slave trade perpetrated from the 15th century onwards in the Americas, the Caribbean, and in the Indian Ocean and Europe against African, Native American, Malagasy, and Indian peoples are a crime against humanity. It is in these words that France, the first country in the world, officially recognized this crime 25 years ago, unambiguously through a law that carries the name of its author, Christian Taubira, and which touches on the ideals of justice, fraternity, and solidarity, which are the basis of the United Nations. The abomination of slavery affected tens of millions of men, women, and children for centuries, riding roughshod over their human rights and denying dignity. We commemorate with you the memory of the victims of this barbarism and the memory of those who fought it, the memory of those who worked to see it abolished. In the sinister litany of crimes that humanity has inflicted on itself, the Shoah, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and mass murders, yes, slavery and the slave trade should be recognized for what they were, an abomination. Recognizing the truth of history and the duty of memory is what we need to do here at the UN. In order for the memory of slavery and the slave trade to be better understood and better known, we must support the work of historians. We must counter denialism and the fake news on social media, which is the new cancer of our time. France is fully committed to do this by working also with our overseas territories and with the African diasporas and our African partners. In 2019, we set up a foundation for the memory of slavery, and we will shortly be inaugurating in Paris the National Memory for Victims of Slavery at the very place where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. We are setting up binational commissions of historians who are responsible for looking into our common past, for instance, with Haiti. We will continue to support the work in this regard of the UN, such as the UNESCO network of places of history and memory. We must redouble efforts to combat racism and modern forms of slavery, which are universal struggles. We must enforce the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and we must continue this struggle even in the digital domain where hate speech can flourish. At a time when forced labor, domestic slavery, sexual exploitation, and migrant trafficking are rife, we need to ensure respect for the relevant ILO conventions and the UN Convention on transnational organized crime. France supports the drafting of an international convention in this domain. President, the duty of civilization means that we must unashamedly combat the instincts of violence and destruction that humanity can harbor. Remembering the horrors of slavery and the slave trade is not just honoring the memory of the victims, it is also protecting the world and humanity. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. I thank the President of the General Assembly for convening this important meeting. My delegation aligns itself with the statement delivered by Ghana on behalf of the Africa Group. Ethiopia joins the international community in solemn remembrance of millions of African men, women, and children who were subjected to the horrors of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. This day stands as a reminder of the gravest crime against humanity and historical injustices. The tragedy of slavery stripped generations of their humanity. The transatlantic slave trade and colonialism represent two of history's most extensive crimes against humanity, leaving legacies that continue to adversely influence Africa's contemporary socio-economic landscape and development trajectory. Slavery, apart from its cruel extractive nature, it disrupted social systems and fundamentally reconfigured economies, governance structures, and cultural institutions across Africa and beyond. As we reflect on this painful chapter, we underscore the importance of education, truth-telling, and the preservation of historical memory. We are of the view that acknowledging this gravest crime against humanity is crucial for honoring the victims and also for compensating with reparation for the atrocities committed. Addressing the structural and historical roots of inequality, including the socio-economic consequences that continue to affect people of Africa and African descent particularly, is important. Commemoration, therefore, must go beyond retrospective remembrance. It must serve as a call to confront the living consequences with courage. In the same vein, Ethiopia commends the leadership of Ghana on behalf of the Africa Group for successfully tabling the draft resolution declaration of the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. In conclusion, we pay tribute to the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and also to those courageous abolitionists who fought to stop such atrocities. We hope this day would serve as a first step to renew our collective determination to rectifying the damage and build a world founded on the inherent dignity of all humanity. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ethiopia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guinea.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my delegation aligns itself with the statement made on behalf of the African Group, and we extend congratulations to His Excellency Mr. John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, who is an advocate for justice and reparations of Africans. We thank him for his leadership on this cause, sadly an inheritance of more than 2 billion people in the world. Enslavement and the transatlantic trade is a dark chapter of our common history, and this has spread to several continents and continues to date to deeply affect our societies. For 4 centuries, anywhere between 12 to 20 million of Africans have their lives destroyed through an odious system which anchor the capture, deportations, or racialized enslavement at the heart of their state. In the history of humanity, no crime has accumulated at the same time the same number of victims, duration, commodification, dehumanization, as was done by slavery and transatlantic trade. No crime produced consequences which were as lasting, in particular, the large-scale destruction of African societies, enshrining racialized inequalities, which unfortunately continue to be the structure of many ways of thinking, including in international relations. It's essential to reject these ways of outdated thinking and to redouble our efforts to fight against all kinds of enslavement, racism, systematic inequality, and structural injustice. Mr. President, on this day of remembrance, It is our duty to reaffirm our collective commitment to intensify our efforts to recognize the historic truth and to undertake measures to provide reparations for crimes. This is not so as to reopen historic divisions, but to recognize reality and the scope of this tragedy, and to make sure that justice is done, and this is begun by recognizing facts. Reparation and justice measures have to be extended to education and awareness raising, especially through forward-looking governance systems which protect human rights, which used to exist in African societies and were deliberately weakened and destroyed by slavery. In this regard, the Kurukan-Fuga Charter or the Mandinka Charter, proclaimed in 1236, have already provided the major principles of social organization and enshrined human rights, in particular the right to life and the preservation of physical integrity of everyone and the participation of women in decision-making. To conclude, my delegation would like to, on behalf of the President of Guinea, reiterates its congratulations to the Republic of Ghana for the efforts which resulted in submitting to our Assembly a draft resolution on trafficking and racial enslavement, and we urge all delegations to endorse this resolution, because by doing thus we will be reaffirming our commitment to liberty, justice, equality, and the respect of human dignity. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Guinea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Señora Presidenta.
President, Colombia thanks you for convening this plenary session commemorating the International Day to commemorate the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. This forum is particularly relevant within a global context where there are narratives that are resurging that aim to deny the past, to play down its effects, or to dehumanize people based on race, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, or religion. I would like to quote President Gustavo Petro. There is just one humanity, and we can overcome the current problems of our time, the climate crisis and poverty, by beginning with a dialogue between civilizations who acknowledge their differences. Slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and colonialism are matters that left scars that still remain. In Colombia, we are well aware of the significance of these issues. They are part of our identity, our struggles, and our commitments. Indeed, confronting history means that we must assess the past honestly, to identify discriminatory structures that still persist, and we need to work together to dismantle them. In this regard, Colombia welcomes the declaration that Ghana has proposed, and we decided to support it as an expression of our commitment to historic justice and to ensure that persons of African descent can fully claim their rights. In order to advance with dignity, we need to acknowledge the ways and forms of exclusion that particularly affected indigenous peoples and persons of African descent, migrants, women, and other historically marginalized people. Recognizing these realities is an essential step to move towards public policies and international frameworks that can promote dignity, meaningful equality, and justice for everyone. In addition, empowering futures means that we need to beef up multilateral mechanisms and cooperation mechanisms to close the gaps and also to rethink how we relate with each other as regions and as peoples. With this in mind, Colombia convened the high-level forum between ECLAC and Africa that was held in Bogota, where we started a bi-regional conversation on how we can redesign our means of cooperation, trade, mobility and knowledge. That meeting showed that in spite of our differences, we are just one humanity, and our regions can build joint solutions to achieve sustainable development, historic justice, digital equality, health, the energy transition, and can strengthen our institutions. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Haiti.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, Haiti welcomes the holding of this commemorative meeting on the abolition of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. For us in Haiti, this more than just a symbol, this date. This is a duty of memory for us, a moral obligation, and a collective responsibility. We fully align ourselves with the statement made by the President of the Republic of Ghana and with the statements made by GRULAC and CARICOM. Mr. President, there are silences that carry across centuries, silences heavy with chains, with suffering and shattered lives. Today, as we take the floor, we do not want to speak only for ourselves, but we want to speak on behalf of all of those whom history has silenced for too long. Women, men, children torn from their land, stripped of their names, their dignity, and their humanity. Today we speak so that they may never again be forgotten. The transatlantic slave trade was not merely a tragedy. It was an organized enterprise of dehumanization. For more than 4 centuries, millions of Africans were reduced to the status of merchandise. Bodies were chained, lives were just numbers, existences were denied, and yet, even in deepest darkness, human dignity never disappeared. And Haiti is a living proof of this. Over 220 years ago, women and men, those who were said to have no voice, no rights, and no future, defied the world order. Not just to break their chains, they broke an idea, the idea according to which some human beings were born to rule and others to be ruled and dominated. And they affirmed at the cost of their blood a simple and universal truth, namely that human dignity has no color. And Haiti says today very clearly that our fight against racism cannot be candid and sincere unless it's accompanied by justice. In every time a child crosses a border in fear, every time one life is deemed less worthy than another, every time history is forgotten, It's a part of the same tragedy which continues. This is a fairly simple truth, but it seems to have forgotten. Haiti was born out of rejection of slavery, rejection of racism, rejection of the denial of humanity. And today it stands before you with an unbroken conviction. The world imagined by those women and men in 1804, a world of equality and dignity, has yet to be achieved. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Haiti. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Namibia.
Mr. President, my delegation welcomes the convening of this commemorative meeting of the General Assembly to mark the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and transatlantic slave trade. Namibia aligns itself with the statement delivered by His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana and African Union champion on advancing the cause of justice and the payment of reparations to Africans on behalf of the African states. My delegation wishes to recognize with appreciation the participation of Ms. Esther Phillips, first Poet Laureate of Barbados, and Ms. Shahada Jek, first Youth Poet Laureate of Toronto, Canada, in this commemorative meeting. Your insightful and moving words added a significant value to our discussion, and we are grateful for your contributions. Mr. President, my delegation commends Ghana for its courage and leadership in advancing our shared commitment to addressing historical injustices committed against Africans and the people of African descent through transatlantic enslavement, colonialism, and apartheid, as well as the inequities that persist in the international economic and political orders. We recall that the atrocities of slavery, the slave trade, colonialism, apartheid, racial segregation, subjugation, and the exploitation of resources denied and violated the humanity and dignity of Africans and people of African descent. Their legacies are not confined to the past, as their social, economic, and cultural consequences continue to be experienced to this day. This year's commemoration is particularly significant due to the introduction of the resolution declaring the trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as a gravest crime against humanity. This resolution offers the international community a collective moment of reflection on enduring legacies of slavery and affirms the African Union's commitment to reparatory justice, historical accountability, and healing of Africans and for the people of African descent. Excellencies, although the international community formally committed itself over a century ago to end slave trade, including through decolonization efforts and the codification of human rights, justice remains incomplete. In particular, gaps persist in legal accountability for colonial wrongs and in addressing the transgenerational social, economic, and cultural harm inflicted on our peoples, communities, and countries. This resolution, therefore, represents an important multilateral step in advancing truth, remembrance, learning, and collective moral responsibility, while keeping open pathways for continued dialogue on reparatory justice. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Namibia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nigeria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Nigeria aligns itself with the statement delivered by His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, on behalf of the African Group and for his leadership in the discourse on this important issue, and in our national capacity underscore the historic importance of this event. We join the global community in the spirit of profound solemnity to honor the memory of the millions of African men, women, children who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade. This was not merely a dark chapter in history, it was a 400-year crime against humanity that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the African continent and the modern world. For Nigeria, this remembrance is personal. The shores from which our ancestors were taken are not merely geographical or geographic markers, they are sacred sites of memory, resilience, and unfinished justice. Confronting history requires history. The transatlantic slave trade was a systemic engine of exploitation to foil the industrial and economic rise of distant shores. Nigeria therefore maintains that true justice begins with a global curriculum that accurately reflects this history, ensuring that the roots of systemic racism and prejudices are identified and dismantled at their sources. Mr. President, advancing dignity is at the heart of our collective responsibility. As we navigate the international decade for people of African descent, we must recognize that the broken bones of slavery have manifested in modern society in systemic marginalization and racial profiling. Therefore, combating modern slavery is essential by eradicating contemporary forms of servitude, including human trafficking, which continue to stain our global conscience. Nigeria stands in solidarity with the people of African descent and calls on all member states to support the resolution to be tabled today. Supporting and voting in favor of this resolution is a roll call of conscience reflecting where member states stand in confronting racism and advancing the reconciliation of historical injustices. Mr. President, in conclusion, we should not let this day end in reflection alone, but it should mark a renewed resolve, a collective commitment to transform memory into action, injustice into equity, and pain into purpose. In doing so, we affirm not only the dignity of those who were lost, but the promise of those who carry their legacy forward. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nigeria. I now give the floor to the observer of the observer state of the Holy See.
President, on this International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, the Holy See delegation joins others in honoring the memory of the millions of people who were victims of enslavement. The Holy See unequivocally condemns slavery, including in its modern forms. The call for remembrance today is a reminder to all states of their duty to uphold historical truth and ensure legal accountability. As Pope Leo stated, since apostolic times, the Church has seen the liberation of the oppressed as a sign of the kingdom of God. This mission of liberation has continued throughout the centuries through concrete actions, especially when the tragedy of slavery and imprisonment has marked entire societies. These convictions have been expressed in numerous papal documents. For example, as early as 1435, Pope Eugene IV condemned the enslavement of the inhabitants of the Canary Islands and excommunicated those who refused to free them. Subsequently, in 1888, Pope Leo XIII condemned slavery as contrary to the Christian values, recalling that God, having created man a reasonable being and after his own likeness, he wished that he should rule only over the brute creation and not be the master of man. Mr. President, the draft declaration under consideration contains a partial narrative which regrettably does not serve the cause of truth. Historical memory, when based on accurate and impartial historical information, together with education and awareness raising, plays a fundamental role in preventing the recurrence of such grave scourges of humanity. At the same time, it is important to reaffirm that under international law, modern slavery constitutes a crime against humanity when committed as a part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population. Therefore, the Holy See reaffirms that no one should be held in slavery or servitude as set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Mr. President, allow me to conclude with the words of Pope Leo, who reminded us that the freedom that Christ gave us is not only interior, it manifests itself in history as love that cares for and frees us from every bond of slavery. Thank you.
I thank the observer of the Observer State of the Holy See. I now give the floor to the observer of the International Authority on Development.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, Excellencies and distinguished delegates, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of His Excellency Dr. Workana Gabayo, the Executive Secretary of IGAD. And I would like to confirm that my delegation aligns with the statement made by the Republic of Ghana on behalf of African states. We gather today in remembrance of a history that reshaped humanity. The transatlantic slave trade scattered families, separated generations, and disrupted the very foundation of human society. Millions were taken, communities were broken, human dignity was denied on a scale that continues to defy global realities. Its consequences did not end. They remain present. Across generations, many still live with the weight of that history through inequality, through limited opportunities, and through systems that continue to reflect those imbalances. Mr. President, although we cannot change the past, we carry full responsibility for how its consequences are addressed. That responsibility is not symbolic. It is practical, and it is immediate. Today, nearly 50 million people are living in condition of modern-day slavery. Throughout labor, human trafficking, and exploitation that continues in different forms. This reality calls for a clarity of purpose. Human dignity must be protected, consistent and without exception. Excellencies, Africa's history reflects both of suffering and strength. From the shores where millions were taken, to moments like Adwa, where dignity was defended with determination, our one principle remains constant. Dignity endures, and it demands recognition. Mr. President, the theme before us, justice in action, confronting history, advancing dignity, empowering future, calls for a steady and deliberated progress. It calls for implementation. It calls for partnership. It calls for accountability. As the Executive Secretary of IGAD has emphasized, justice gains meaning when action reflects memory. Excellencies, the United Nations provides the framework. Member states provide the leadership. And together, progress becomes possible. Sustained implementation of commitment is essential. Continued cooperation is necessary. And shared responsibility must remain at the center of our effort. Mr. President, this day is a day of what humanity has endured. It is also a reminder of what humanity can correct. Through consistent effort, through principled action, and through collective resolve, we can continue to advance dignity and inclusion. Let this be a moment that strengthens that direction. And I thank you.
I thank the observer of the International Authority on Development. We have heard the last speaker in this commemorative meeting. The Assembly has thus concluded its commemorative meeting to mark the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and Transatlantic Slave Trade. Action on the draft resolution submitted under this item will take place after the collection of the ballots for the appointment of members of the board of the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production patterns. The Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 119. The Assembly will consider Sub-Item 1 of Agenda Item 115 entitled Appointment of Members of the Board of the 10-year Framework of Programs on Sustainable Consumption and Production Patterns. Members will recall that the Assembly, by its Resolution 67/203 of 21 December 2012, decided to establish the 10-member board consisting of 2 members from each United Nations General Group, Regional Group. In its Decision 67/564 of 16 September 2013, the Assembly decided that regional groups shall be authorized to nominate new members of the board. Furthermore, by its Resolution 69/214 of 19 December 2014, the Assembly decided that the duration of subsequent terms for members of the board shall continue to be 2 years, starting on 16 September of every second year, and that the United Nations regional groups may nominate one of their existing 2 members of the board for 1 consecutive term, while ensuring that no member state is eligible to serve more than 2 consecutive terms, and taking into account the importance of ensuring continuity and rotation in the work of the board. Members will also recall that in its Decision 78/418 of 13 August 2024, the Assembly decided that the 2-year term of the members of the board shall begin on 21 March 2024, the date of their appointment, taking into account Resolution 69/214 of 19 December 2014. The Assembly subsequently appointed members of the board for terms ending on 20 March 2026. Consequently, the Assembly needs to appoint 10 members of the board for a new term of office. Bearing in mind the provisions of Resolution 69/214 as outlined above, I propose that the new 2-year term of the members of the board shall begin on the date of their appointment. That is today, 25 March 2026. May I take it that the Assembly wishes to proceed accordingly? It is so decided. In view of the request made at the 73rd plenary meeting held on 10 March 2026, the Assembly will now proceed to this appointment by secret ballot. With regard to the candidatures, I should like to inform members of the following nominations by regional groups. For the 2 seats from among the African states, only one endorsed state has been communicated, namely the Republic of South Africa. For the 2 seats from among the Asia-Pacific states, only one state has been communicated, namely India. For the 2 seats from among the Eastern European states, two states have been communicated, namely Hungary and the Russian Federation. For the 2 seats from among the Latin American and Caribbean states, the following 2 endorsed states have been communicated, namely Barbados and Mexico. For the 2 seats from among the Western European and other states, the following 2 endorsed states have been communicated, namely Finland and Germany. Before we begin the voting process, I should like to remind members that, pursuant to Rule 88 of the Rules of Procedure of the General Assembly, no representative shall interrupt the voting except on a point of order on the actual conduct of the voting. Any announcements, including those concerning withdrawals of candidatures, should therefore be made prior to the commencement of the voting process. That is to say, before the announcement of the beginning of the voting process. In addition, ballot papers will only be given to the delegates seated directly behind the country's nameplate. We shall now begin the voting process. Ballot papers marked A, B, C, D, and E will now be distributed, and the voting has thus begun. In accordance with Resolution 71/323 of 8 September 2017, the names of the states that have been communicated to the Secretariat at least 48 hours prior to the election today have been printed on the ballot papers for each of the regional groups. Only those candidates nominated by the regional groups are eligible for this appointment and are indicated on the ballot paper. I request representatives to use only those ballot papers that have been distributed and to put an X in the ballot boxes next to the names of states whom they wish to vote for. There shall be no write-ins. A blank ballot paper will be considered an abstention. If a ballot paper contains any notation other than votes in favor of eligible member states, those notations will be disregarded. I invite the representatives of the following states to serve as tellers and to accompany the conference officers as they collect the ballot papers. Brunei Darussalam, Ecuador, Italy, Lesotho, Montenegro, and Sweden. I invite the representatives of the flowing states to serve as tellers and to accompany the conference officers as they collect the ballot papers. Brunei Darussalam, Ecuador, Italy, Lesotho, Montenegro, and Sweden. Please proceed to collect the ballot papers. May I request delegations who have not voted to do so now by approaching the podium to cast their votes. The voting is now closed. No more ballot papers will be accepted. In the interest of time, the Assembly will now proceed to consider the other items announced in the United Nations Journal while the ballots are being counted. The Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of sub-item 1 of Agenda Item 115. The Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 119 entitled Commemoration of the Abolition of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade to take action on a proposal announced in the journal. I give the floor to His Excellency Samuel Okudzeto Ablakwa, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ghana, on behalf of the African Group, to introduce Draft Resolution A/80/L.48.
The President of the General Assembly, Your Excellencies, permanent representatives, distinguished delegates, today we gather in solemn reflection on the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, a day when humanity pauses to remember millions of women, men, and children whose lives were stolen, whose dignity was denied, and whose humanity was questioned, yet whose resilience reshaped the moral arc of our shared history. This day is not merely an act of remembrance. It is a call to conscience. It reminds us that memory without action risks becoming silent, and silence has never been the ally of justice. Your Excellencies, in September 2025, during the general debate of the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, the President of Ghana, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, announced that Ghana will introduce a draft resolution entitled Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and Racialized Chattel Enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. 6 months to this very day, I have the distinct honor to present this resolution to the General Assembly on behalf of the African Group. This resolution does not create legal hierarchies of crime, as some have wrongly suggested. Neither is it about reopening history. It is about completing history. It does not target individual states, nor does it seek division. Rather, it establishes a principled framework for reconciliation grounded in truth. At its heart, this draft resolution is forward-looking and unifying. It is focused on truth, remembrance, education, and dialogue. It is grounded not in retribution, but in moral recognition. And it is intended to strengthen global efforts to combat racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia in all its forms. Excellencies, its objectives are clear: to provide formal and unequivocal recognition within the United Nations system of the world-breaking and world-redefining impact of the enslavement of Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans and people of African descent, to affirm their enduring consequences, not only for Africa and the people of African descent, but all of humanity, to reinforce ongoing global efforts toward reparatory justice through dialogue and cooperation, and to strengthen international solidarity in the fight against systemic racism and historical denialism. Distinguished delegates, the African Group expresses its sincere appreciation to all delegations for their constructive engagement throughout the negotiations. We believe that the present draft reflects the broadest possible views of member states on this important issue. Regrettably, legal technicalities and procedural arguments have been invoked to once again silence voices, to bury history, obscure clarity, and to prevent this noble institution from speaking plainly and firmly. But history does not disappear when ignored. Truth does not weaken when delayed. Crime does not rot, as we say in Africa. And justice does not expire with time. In affirming this declaration, we do more than honor memories. We strengthen the very foundations of justice upon which the United Nations was built. We affirm that human dignity is indivisible, that suffering must be acknowledged, and that reconciliation begins with truth courageously spoken. Your Excellencies, the founder of Ghana, Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, proclaimed, quote, "Slavery was not born of racism. Rather, racism was a consequence of slavery. With this racial twist was invented the myth of color inferiority," unquote. Your Excellencies, the generation that founded this organization emerged from the ashes of global tragedy and pledged that humanity would never again look away from crimes that shock the conscience of humankind. Today, we are called to uphold that promise. The African Group, our co-sponsors, CARICOM, CELAC, our broad coalition of people with good conscience, including the NAACP, the Congressional Black Caucus, members of Parliament in the House of Commons, and other places, are sending a very clear message. They are calling upon all member states to stand on the right side of history and in our shared humanity to vote in favor of this resolution, and in doing so, reaffirm not only the past we remember, but the future we seek to build together. A future of social justice, a future of equality, and a future of mutual respect for human life. I thank you very much, Your Excellencies.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ghana. We shall now proceed to consider Draft Resolution A/80/L.48. I give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Thank you, Mr. President. The present oral statement is made in the context of Rule 153 of the Rules of Procedure of the Assembly. The present statement has also been distributed to Member States. The request contained in Operative Paragraph 15 of the draft resolution would constitute an addition to the workload of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Department for the General Assembly and Conference Management in 2027, and entail additional resource requirements net of staff assessment in the amount of $117,700 in 2027. Detailed cost estimates and their underlying assumptions for the requirements are provided in the annex to this statement, which has been circulated. Accordingly, should the General Assembly adopt the draft resolution L48, additional resource requirements estimated in the amount of $117,700 net of staff assessment would be included in the proposed program budget for 2027 under Section 2, General Assembly and Economic and Social Council Affairs and Conference Management, and Section 24, Human Rights for the consideration of the General Assembly at its 81st session. In addition, an amount of $12,800 would be included under Section 36, staff assessment, to be offset by an equivalent amount under Income Section 1, income from staff assessment. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegations listed on the EU document, the foreign countries have also become co-sponsors of A/80/L48. Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Bangladesh, Belize, Brazil, Colombia, Haiti, Maldives, Pakistan, St. Lucia, Tajikistan, Timor-Leste, and the State of Palestine. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor L48, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. I see Kyrgyzstan, the Philippines, Cameroon, although Cameroon is already on the L document. That concludes additional co-sponsorship. Thank you, Mr. President.
Before giving the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that they are strongly urged to limit explanations of vote to 5 minutes, which should in any case not exceed 10 minutes and be made from their seats. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States remains steadfast in its opposition and condemnation of historic wrongs that resulted from the transatlantic slave trade, the trans-Saharan slave trade, and all other forms of slavery. We remain committed to the acknowledgement that these historical wrongs. Despite this, the United States observes that the text of this resolution remains highly problematic in countless respects. Consequently, the United States cannot support the adoption of this resolution. We regret that the United States must once again remind this body that the United Nations exists to maintain international peace and security. It was not founded to advance narrow, specific interests and agendas, to establish niche international days, or to create new costly meeting and reporting mandates. This resolution does all three. The United States has defined long-standing objectives to the framing of reparatory justice and the duty of reparation for historical wrongs. While we acknowledge the horrors of the past, we do not accept this resolution's assertion that historical facts from the 15th through 19th century constitute violations of jus cogens, as the term is understood in contemporary international law. The United States also does not recognize a legal right to reparations for historical wrongs that were not illegal under international law at the time they occurred. In addition to its obvious legal problems, this resolution is also unclear as to who the recipients of reparatory justice would be. The drafters and supporters of this resolution seem to believe it is them. The United States strongly objects to the cynical usage of historical wrongs as a leverage point in an attempt to reallocate modern resources to people and nations who are distantly related to the historical victims. As stated at the outset of these negotiations, the United States also strongly objects to the resolution's attempt to rank crimes against humanity in any type of hierarchy. The assertion that some crimes against humanity are less severe than others objectively diminishes the suffering of countless victims and survivors of other atrocities throughout history. This is not a competition. This attempted ranking is also simply incorrect as a matter of law. The United States would also like to express disappointment in the arbitrary historical perspective of the text. Trafficking in African slaves began long before the 15th century and sadly continued even after the 19th. These dates were clearly selected for political reasons rather than historical accuracy. All trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans deserve to be condemned, not merely the political expedient. Also, there are some fake news articles suggesting that the sponsors of this resolution called into question President Trump's support of the black community. We reject any such suggestions. Indeed, President Trump has done more for black Americans than any other president and enjoyed historic support from the black community in the 2024 election. He is working tirelessly to deliver for them and make our country greater than ever. Finally, we must express our deep disappointment regarding the process that led to this text. Throughout drafting, the United States and other delegations offer constructive contributions aimed at aligning the text with the established international legal frameworks. These contributions were ignored. For these reasons, the United States will vote no on this resolution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the representative of Cyprus on behalf of the European Union.
Thank you, Chair. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as San Marino, align themselves with this statement. We welcome the African Union's initiative in advancing a dedicated resolution to one of the most heinous episodes in human history. The transatlantic slave trade remains an unparalleled tragedy, which lasted for over 3 centuries and involved unspeakable atrocities, affecting millions of Africans. It cannot and should not be forgotten. At the 7th Summit of the African Union and the European Union last November in Angola, European and African leaders jointly recognized and profoundly regretted the untold suffering inflicted on millions of people as a result of the slave trade, colonialism, and apartheid. The EU is committed to shedding light on the history of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as their causes, consequences, and lasting impacts. It is our collective responsibility to learn from the wrongs of the past. We have to redress their enduring effects by removing barriers and tackling disparities that still hinder equal participation in society by the descendants of those affected. The EU is actively engaged across all relevant fora, including via the EU-AU Human Rights Dialogue process, to make progress on this issue. We acknowledge that further efforts are necessary, and we stand ready to continue working with partners in this direction. The recently adopted EU anti-racist strategy underscores the continued relevance of tackling the legacy of slavery, making this an important element on the fight against structural racism. This resolution was presented as a forward-looking and unifying process. It offered a meaningful opportunity to foster unity among UN member states to jointly address an issue of paramount importance for all. Regrettably, we were not able to reach a consensual outcome in the short time frame allocated to negotiations. We also regret that the proponents of the resolution did not reconsider their approach despite our repeated calls for more openness to constructive comments. Chair, we regret that our key concerns were not adequately reflected in the final text. We are concerned that this will send a wrong message on an issue where we do not fundamentally disagree. We were prepared to support a text that emphasizes the scale of the atrocity of the transatlantic slave trade, the importance of remembrance, and the need to continue combating slavery in its contemporary forms. Instead, the text before us raises a number of legal and factual concerns that we cannot overlook. First, the use of superlatives in the context of crimes against humanity is not legally accurate, such as the use of graves in the title and throughout the text, which implies a hierarchy among atrocity crimes, when no legal hierarchy between crimes against humanity exists. It risks undermining the harm suffered by all victims of these crimes and lacks legal clarity crucial for ensuring accountability. We firmly reject introducing ambiguity in this respect. Second, the selective inclusion of lengthy, historical, and contentious references to regional jurisprudence and selective and unbalanced interpretation of historical events, such as in preambular paragraphs 21 and 23, is at odds with accepted UN practice, as well as the stated universal and forward-looking objective of this initiative. It risks creating divisions when unity is both necessary and achievable. The role of the General Assembly is not to substitute itself to the academic debate amongst historians. Third, we are also concerned by certain legal references and assertions that are either inaccurate or inconsistent with international law. This includes suggestions of a retroactive application of international rules which were non-existent at the time, and claims for reparations, which is incompatible with established principles of international law. The principle of non-retroactivity, a fundamental cornerstone of the international legal order, must be strictly upheld. References to claims for reparations also lack a sound legal basis. Any framework for reparatory justice must be grounded in existing multilateral instruments. For these reasons, the Member States of the European Union regret that they are not in a position to support Resolution A/80/L48. Repeating our strongest condemnation of the slave trade and reaffirming our genuine commitment that we have demonstrated through concrete domestic and international action, we are compelled to abstain, solely out of profound respect for the subject matter and its complexities. This abstention should not be interpreted as leniency toward these apparent practices, nor in any case as acceptance of or acquiescence to the legal formulations in the text. We reserve our full position on these matters in all current and future relevant processes. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cyprus on behalf of the European Union. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nicaragua.
Señor Presidente.
President, Nicaragua would like to thank Ghana and Africa for presenting this resolution, which has true historic, moral and political relevance for peoples who were victims of invasion, occupation and European conquest that led to colonialism, slavery, the looting of natural resources, and the subsequent suffering from this genocide perpetrated against our people, destroying cultures that the European invaders, with their limited knowledge, did not possess the capacity to understand the social, philosophical and spiritual structures thereof, which led to barbarism and the extermination of entire peoples. For the people of our Americas, this memory is an inherent part of our determination to be free and never slaves. Nicaragua, in its struggle against colonialism, abolished slavery and its atrocities in 1821, and we recognize that the transatlantic slave trade of our African brothers and sisters and racialized slavery were one of the most cruel manifestations in history, whose scars continue to be present up till today. In our continent, slavery, colonial violence, looting, the denial of dignity and the denial of the rights of peoples and displacement led to the loss of millions of lives and left deep-seated historic consequences that still remain today even centuries later in our countries. Nicaragua therefore believes that this resolution should be understood in the broadest historical context, consistent with the position that the General Assembly has taken on the urgent need to put an end, once and for all, to colonialism and neocolonialism, and also the need to continue affirming people's rights to self-determination and to uphold their ancestral values. President, Nicaragua will vote in favor of the resolution as a result of its political, moral, and historical weight. We also note that Nicaragua is not party to the Rome Statute, and that instrument doesn't have a universal nature, and nor indeed are we party to the ICC, and we don't recognize the jurisdiction of that court, and that is why we disassociate from PP27. We also recognize the importance of the fact that the African Union, our community of Latin American and Caribbean states, and CARICOM have been working with the United Nations on this critical issue. We also would like to express our gratitude to those who struggled to see the abolition of slavery, to the Haitian people and their historic contribution, as they were the first republic in our region to be free from slavery and to reach independence in 1804. They abolished slavery and they showed the way for other countries. Decades later, Frederick Douglass said, and I quote, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." President, we reaffirm our solidarity with all of the victims of slavery, racism, and discrimination, and we make clear our commitment to historic truth, dignity of victims, and the need for the international community to continue to address these crimes in order for there to be historic justice, redress, and dignity, given the consequences and the legacy of slavery, the slave trade, and colonialism. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nicaragua. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, France would like to explain its vote. The abomination of slavery was active for centuries and impacted tens of millions of women, children, and men, undermining the very principle of human dignity. Given the tragedy that the transatlantic slave trade and slavery represented, we need to face this history and recognize that it is a truthful fact, and for France shoulder its share of that truth, including refusing to forget that. And that is why for several decades we have been mobilizing itself to make sure that the memory of slavery, its victims and those who fought it, be preserved through the law known by its drafter, Ms. Christiane Taubira, passed 25 years ago. We were the first country in the world to officially recognize and to do so strongly and without any ambiguity the fact that the trade and the enslavement perpetrated since the 15th century in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, and in Europe against the African, American, Indian, Malagasy, and Indian populations was a crime against humanity. End of quote. We support the work done by historians and strengthen our cultural and educational cooperation in this regard. In 2019, we created a foundation for the memory of slavery, which works to move forward the historic knowledge therein and to keep the memory of victims, those who fought for abolition, contributing to fight against racism and discrimination in our contemporary societies. Very soon, we will inaugurate the National Memorial to Victims of Slavery in Paris, at the very place where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. Mr. President, As was done by our partners of the European Union, France will abstain on voting on the text because we think that the resolution proposed gives rise to a number of difficulties under international law. We refer you in this regard to the declaration that has just been made on behalf of by the European Union and its member states. We regret also the fact that this resolution seems to establish a hierarchy amongst crimes against humanity. This gives rise to serious legal difficulties. In addition to that, it runs the risk of creating a competition against historic tragedies which should not be compared. And what is done, it's done to the detriment of the memory of victims. At the time when the United Nations is working on the development of a new international convention on the prevention and suppression of crimes against humanity, it seems to us important to recall that any and all resolution from the General Assembly has to be centered in international law and a universal approach to human rights. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France. We have had the last speaker in explanation of vote before the vote. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/80/L48 entitled Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and Racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as a gravest crime against humanity. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of the draft resolution A/80/L48, please signify. Those against and those in abstention.
The Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/80/L48 entitled Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and Racialized Chattel Enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 123, against 3, abstentions 52. Therefore, draft resolution A/80/L48 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that they are strongly urged to limit explanations of vote to 5 minutes, which should in any case not exceed 10 minutes and be made from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, I have the honor to deliver a statement on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean Community CARICOM in explanation of our vote. CARICOM voted in support of this resolution because of our historical attachment to the issue of the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans. The recognition today by those member states that supported this resolution and the declaration is a critical first step towards redressing the injustices perpetuated over the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. In this vein, CARICOM remains a strong advocate for the advancement of reparatory justice for the historical atrocities perpetuated against our forebears during the period of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the persistent legacies thereof. CARICOM therefore reiterates our support in principle for this initiative undertaken by Ghana on behalf of the African Union to advance the issue of reparatory justice. Given the importance of this issue, CARICOM stresses that implementation of the resolution must be done in a collaborative manner and in full partnership with the entire membership. CARICOM commits to contributing to taking forward the implementation of this resolution in line with the region's priorities, including the 10-point plan for reparatory justice. We will continue to engage meaningfully in future discussions on this important issue, including on ways to take forward the important provisions contained in the resolution. I thank you, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Thank you, President. It is clear from the grim testimony that we have heard today that slavery and the transatlantic slave trade were appalling tragedies of an historic scale that constitute grave violations of human dignity and of the fundamental human rights of its victims. New Zealand recognises the profound and lasting impacts of the transatlantic slave trade and thanks Ghana for its efforts in bringing forward this resolution. We acknowledge the historical legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and its lasting impact on many member states, and we welcome the importance placed on continuing education and awareness raising and the increased attention that commemorative events have brought to the issue. New Zealand supports proposals for meaningful, truthful and respectful dialogue among those most impacted, including reparatory justice and reconciliation through appropriate frameworks. We encourage the continued promotion of comprehensive educational programs, memorialization initiatives and research on slavery, the trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans and their consequences. We had hoped to be able to vote in favour of this resolution, but regrettably New Zealand was not in a position to endorse all aspects of the text presented today. New Zealand acknowledges the significance and horrific scale of transatlantic slavery, but it is not able to endorse a text that suggests a hierarchy of crimes against humanity and which has implications for other multilateral processes underway related to the progressive development of international law. New Zealand acknowledges the importance of restorative justice processes, including issues such as reparations, but believes these are more appropriately pursued through relevant judicial tribunals or agreed international legal forums. New Zealand was, unfortunately, not able to vote in favour of the text today, but we thank Ghana and the other co-sponsors once again for the resolution and reaffirm our support for meaningful dialogue, education and progress on addressing the impacts of the transatlantic slave trade. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Thank you, President. Peru would like to thank the distinguished delegation of Ghana for this initiative, which has made it possible for us to undertake a serious analysis about the seriousness of these issues. Our vote is consistent with the international commitments that Peru has undertaken in line with our struggle to eradicate racism and all of its structural manifestations. Peru voted in favour of the draft resolution. We are convinced that the transatlantic slave trade of Africans and the system of racialized slavery were violations of human rights of such scope that they demand the attention of the international community today. Their consequences are still being felt today in our societies. Our vote is also an act of recognition to the Afro-Peruvian communities. Some 200,000 Peruvians identify as such in our territory. This constitutes about 4% of our national population. But their political, economic, social and cultural legacy goes beyond these figures, and it is part and parcel of our national identity. Peru has moved forward concrete policies in this domain, including the national policy for Peruvians of African descent going to 2030. But we'd like to make clear some interpretations of this resolution. First of all, we believe that the characterization of the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity contained in OP 2 and 3 is a reference to a particularly serious event in the past which occurred at a specific time in history. We recognize that in line with international law, the commission of an illegal act is something that, if it continues, there have to be appropriate guarantees of repetition and redress adopted. But we note that OP 6 to 8 can be interpreted as a call for constructive dialogue. But this is not in prejudice to the establishment of obligations that could be interpreted as legally binding. The quest for justice should be something that is accessible, universal, and inclusive, free from all kinds of discrimination. The principles reaffirmed in this resolution should be a way of guiding states and should contribute to recognizing the dignity of human beings. Finally, we believe that, well, we would have preferred that a resolution on such an important issue should have been adopted by consensus. We reiterate our solidarity with all of those persons of African descent, and we particularly recognize the damaging legacy of slavery that persists today in a world where there is still racial discrimination as a result of this historical legacy. We will continue to work constructively in the context of this dialogue, and we hope that we can achieve this by consensus. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Peru. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein on behalf of Switzerland and Iceland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I deliver this joint explanation of vote on behalf of Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. At the outset, we underline the importance of the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and commend efforts to ensure that the profound suffering caused by the trafficking of enslaved Africans is never forgotten nor diminished. To address the enduring consequences of slavery crimes, Liechtenstein launched the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative to combat modern forms of slavery and human trafficking. Against this background, the process leading to the adoption of this declaration is unfortunately a missed opportunity to broaden consensus and recognize the unprecedented nature of these crimes. We believe that more time and meaningful negotiations were needed to galvanize further support. Although we stressed our intention to support the spirit of this initiative, we, alongside others, raised concerns about inconsistencies of the declaration with international law. In particular, the qualification of the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity has no basis in international law and risks undermining the Rome Statute protecting civilian populations not only against enslavement, but also against other equally atrocious crimes against humanity. This is all the more regrettable as discussions on the inclusion of slavery crimes in the definition of crimes against humanity are taking place at the moment, both as part of the efforts to draft a convention on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity, and also within the framework of the Rome Statute. These discussions are essential to guarantee that such atrocities are not repeated and that modern forms of slavery do not go unpunished. For these reasons, while we strongly support the underlying objective of recognition, we were unfortunately not in a position to vote in favor of the resolution as adopted. We remain committed to engaging constructively and support the remembrance of the trafficking, the transatlantic slave trade consistent with international law. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein on behalf of Switzerland and Iceland. I have the honor now to give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. The United Kingdom recognises the gravity of the issues addressed in this resolution and welcomes the opportunity to set out its position. We have repeatedly recognised the abhorrent nature of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, which inflicted untold harm and misery on millions of people over many decades. Its horrors were profound, and its legacy continues to leave deep scars today. The UK also believes that only by acknowledging and discussing collectively the most painful elements of the history that we share with other nations, including the transatlantic slave trade, can we come together in a spirit of solidarity and mutual respect to respond to the challenges that we all face today. The UK remains committed to that goal. That is why we engaged constructively throughout the negotiations on this resolution in the hope of reaching a consensual-based text. However, despite our efforts, our concerns have not been taken on board. The UK continues to disagree with fundamental propositions of the text and therefore, regrettably, could not vote in favour of it. Firstly, the UK is firmly of the view that we must not create a hierarchy of historical atrocities. Doing so simplifies the complexity and vast scale of suffering endured in different contexts. It risks diminishing the experiences of communities whose trauma and suffering was felt just as strongly. No single set of atrocities should be regarded as more or less significant than another. We should approach all historical injustices with the same seriousness, empathy, and respect to ensure that no one group is made to feel that their suffering is being overshadowed or treated as secondary. Furthermore, it's essential and integral to the rule of law that the formation and evolution of international law is governed by clear and well-defined principles. The principles of intertemporality and non-retroactivity are long-standing tenets of international law. They are essential to ensuring legal stability. According to the intertemporal rule, the applicable law is the law of the relevant time. International courts and tribunals have routinely upheld these principles. There is equally no duty to provide reparation for historical acts that were not, at the time those acts were committed, violations of international law. These principles cannot be circumvented by recourse to the concept of continuing harms. The UK welcomes that states have developed international law such that today's slavery and the slave trade are rightly prohibited by treaties and under customary international law, and enslavement is now recognised as a constituent element of a crime against humanity. Nonetheless, it's important to acknowledge with deep regret that the prohibitions on slavery, the slave trade, and what are now considered crimes against humanity had not yet been established in international law at the time of the transatlantic slave trade. None of the recognised sources of international law, as set out in Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, identify a prohibition on slavery and the slave trade until the 20th century. The United Kingdom appreciates that Ghana, on behalf of the African Union, consistently stressed that this resolution was not to be read as a legal document. This was restated by the drafters at every informal consultation. In this context, the UK and others offered specific language to move the text away from legal to political discourse, while still reflecting the sheer gravity and horror of the acts. Member States also suggested the text should be considered by the Sixth Committee. Again, this was met with the response that this was a political declaration. The United Kingdom is keen to underscore this point on the AU's intention, while we continue to regret the failure to accept language that would have put the matter beyond doubt. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. I give the floor to the representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
The Kingdom of the Netherlands remains firmly committed to addressing racism and discrimination. We share the importance that the African group attaches to the lasting consequences of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. We fully recognize the profound injustice of this history and its continued impact today. In December 2022, the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of the Netherlands offered formal apologies for the actions of the Dutch state towards enslaved people in the past, who suffered as a consequence of those actions everywhere in the world, as well as to all their descendants up to the present day. In July 2023, His Majesty King Willem-Alexander apologized for the Netherlands' slavery past. As a member of the European Union, we engage constructively in the negotiations on this resolution, and we greatly appreciate the efforts by Ghana and the African Union to bring forward this important initiative. In this vein, I would like to also say that we align ourselves with the statement delivered by the EU, and we sincerely regret that no consensus could be reached on a formulation that addresses key legal and substantive concerns. Having said that, the Kingdom of the Netherlands cannot support references that suggest the retroactive application of international law, including the implication of a legal obligation to provide reparations for acts that were not a violation of international law at the time they were committed. We also cannot agree to the introduction of a hierarchy among crimes against humanity, including the designation of one as the gravest, nor to references related to the non-applicability of statutory limitations. For these reasons, Mr. Chair, and despite the importance we attach to this very subject matter, my delegation has abstained on this resolution. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ik twijfel nu.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Netherlands. We have now had the last speaker in explanation of vote after the vote for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers in explanations of vote after the vote at a later date to be announced. The Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 119. Before adjourning the meeting, I will announce the results of the secret ballot. The Assembly will resume its consideration of sub-item 1 of Agenda Item 115 entitled Appointment of Members of the Board of the 10-Year Framework of Programs on Sustainable Consumption and Production Patterns. The result of the voting is as follows. Group A, African States, number of ballot papers 180, number of invalid ballots 0, number of valid ballots 180, abstentions 7, number of members present and voting 173, required majority 87, number of votes obtained by each member state, South Africa 173. Group B, Asia Pacific States, number of ballot papers 180, number of invalid ballots 0, number of valid ballots 180, abstentions 4, number of members present and voting 176, Required majority 89. Number of votes obtained by each member state. India 176. Group C, Eastern European states. Number of ballot papers 180. Number of invalid ballots 0. Number of valid ballots 180. Abstentions 7. Number of members present and voting 173. Required majority 87. Number of votes obtained by each member state. Hungary 158. Russian Federation 126. Group D, Latin American and Caribbean states. Number of ballot papers 180. Number of invalid ballots 0. Number of valid ballots 180. Abstentions 6. Number of members present and voting 174. Required majority 88. Number of votes obtained by each member state. Barbados 173. Mexico 168. Group E, Western European and other states. Number of ballot papers 180. Number of invalid ballots 0. Number of valid ballots 180. Abstentions 11. Number of members present and voting 169. Required majority 85. Number of votes obtained by each member state. Finland 168. Germany 166. The following states have thus been appointed as members of the board of the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production patterns for a term beginning on 25 March 2026 and ending on 24 March 2028. Barbados, Finland, Germany, Hungary, India, Mexico, the Russian Federation, and the Republic of South Africa. I thank the tellers for their assistance. Members are reminded that the following vacancies remain to be filled for a term beginning on the date of the appointment and expiring on 24 March 2028. 1 member from among the African states and 1 member from the Asia-Pacific states. The Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of sub-item 1 of Agenda Item 115. I thank the interpreters for the extension granted. The meeting is therefore adjourned.
Magandang gabi.
Magandang gabi.
Is that good Tagalog?
It's okay.